My name is Gareth Evans. I'm the director here. First question I always ask, how many people have been here before? A whole bunch. Good. If you have not, please take the opportunity to take a look around. We are decorated, shockingly, for Christmas. Upstairs is full of trees as well. It's all very festive around here. Our volunteers go wild every year, so you should check it out. We have a bunch of events coming up as well. A Christmas stroll a week on Saturday, a Nights of Lights right before Christmas, all of which are events designed to highlight the decorations, the place, the season, and all that as well. So come back and see us for some history and festivities. So this evening's talk by Dr. Angela Zombek. We've been wanting to have this here for a while. We've been chatting about it. She's relatively new to town. Yeah. And is an assistant professor of history at UNCW, specializing in local history and the topic we're about to hear about this evening. You may know that Wilmington obviously was a big Civil War town. This house was occupied by, as a Union headquarters at the end of the war in 1865, after the fall of Fort Fisher, which was kind of one of the last major acts of that war. So the place is quite linked to this. There were POW camps here, in Salisbury and elsewhere as well during that war, some of which will come up tonight, I'm sure. I'm going to read it off here because I don't want to get this title wrong. And look at this technology. It works for a second here. She is the author of Penitentiaries, Punishment, and Military Prisons, a book that came out this year, and I want to get that title right, and which we have here, if you're interested in buying that and reading it. We can do a book signing at the end of this. The books are available over in the gift shop. She's here to sign them right here. But I'll let that go and just say thank you so much for coming. Yeah. Thank you for coming as well, and Dr. Angela Zombek.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you everybody for coming out. Oh. I grew up in Cleveland, but I spent the last 12 years in Florida, and I'm naturally cold, so I'm going to leave the coat on. So, as Gareth said, the talk I'm going to give tonight is basically revolving around the research that I did for my book. And what I want to start off by saying is, when we think about wars, especially like the Civil War, we think about the war defining a century. But in the case of imprisonment, I argue that the 19th century defined how Civil War contemporaries dealt with the issue of imprisonment. So before I kind of delve into the case studies to illustrate that, I just wanted to give a general overview of the numbers of men and women who were incarcerated during the Civil War. So the first total up there, the total POWs, is just POWs, 674,000. That doesn't include the civilians that were held north and south. Record keeping wasn't all that solid, so one government report estimates that on both sides, the Union and the Confederacy each detained about 13,500 civilians, including men and women, throughout the course of the war. The question that usually comes to mind when we think about Civil War prisons is suffering. And so I have here the statistics on the number of POWs that died in confinement. Confederacy, about 30,000, Union, about 25,000. This became a massive crisis that really Union and Confederate officials didn't quite know how to deal with. And so as the war went on, both national governments looked to the antebellum period to figure out how to manage the immense number of prisoners that actually ended up in their hands. So that's what we're going to spend the bulk of the evening talking about. So the way I see it, the Penitentiary Program really defined how military prison officials dealt with the crisis of imprisonment. The United States, having no standing army based on constitutional ban, and having really limited experience in war throughout the 19th century, didn't have a model of how to deal with military prisoners. And that kind of makes sense because even if we think back to the Revolution, the British Empire was becoming the strongest empire on the planet, but when they fought the American patriots in the Revolution, they didn't have a system for dealing with prisoners of war either. They improvised. And so when the Civil War broke out, Union and Confederate officials looked to the previous wars that they fought to figure out how to manage the crisis of imprisonment. But I think more so, they looked to the Penitentiary Program. And a few things to say about that. Number one, the state governments had the most experience in dealing with imprisonment. State governors were in charge of penitentiaries. The federal government actually only had one penitentiary in existence in the entire antebellum period. And the way that long-term imprisonment as punishment developed during the 19th century kind of set the tone and the expectations for imprisonment throughout the broader century itself. And this bled into the Civil War. And so basically, the establishment of the penitentiary program in the antebellum period defined the expectation for prison operation. It defined inmates' identities. So when we get to the Civil War, even though the laws of war drew a clear distinction between a prisoner of war and a criminal, because this is the only type of incarceration that people knew about, even prisoners of war who were not deemed criminal couldn't help but think about themselves in that way. So they assumed the stigma of imprisonment. The penitentiary program also established the idea that punishment should be just, that prisoners should work to basically pay for themselves. There was an expectation that was established in the civilian world that law-abiding citizens shouldn't have to pay for the upkeep of prisoners. And so prison labor became initiated in penitentiaries. There was also an expectation that prisoners should reform, and they should do that by a program of solitary confinement, by education, and also by religious instruction. So the state dictated that there should be a chaplain apparent in the penitentiaries, but the extent to which that actually happened varied, because there were usually not so many funds available for that chaplain's salary. But that expectation for reform and for religious instruction was set in the antebellum period. So throughout the book, I did a number of case studies. The first case study that I looked at was in Virginia, the Confederate capital of Richmond. The Virginia Penitentiary was constructed in 1796. It opened in 1800, and it had a capacity of 168. I also wanted to compare the penitentiaries to a military prison. So in Richmond, I picked Castle Thunder. Castle Thunder had a capacity of 1,400, and it was a really interesting prison because it held Confederate deserters, political prisoners, black and female prisoners in the same building, which was an interesting thing to say in respect to the South. And it also later held deserters and federal prisoners of war. The next case study that I looked at was Georgia. I wanted to know if this thought that I had about the penitentiary program influencing military prisons applied to the most notorious prison of Andersonville. Andersonville was constructed haphazardly, really, and with what resources the Confederacy had left by 1864. Originally, it was 16 acres. It was later expanded in the summer of 1864 to 26 acres. And it had a capacity that ranged from 10 to 12,000. But at its height, the maximum population that was held in Andersonville was around 32,000. And so that's why we're looking at that image there. You can really see the crowding apparent. The Georgia Penitentiary in the state of Georgia was in Milledgeville, which in the 19th century was the capital of Georgia. It was proposed in 1803. After the state revised its penal code in 1816, the penitentiary was constructed. It opens in 1817 and had a relatively small capacity. There were 23 lodging cells and then 4 cells for refractory inmates. Moving on to Washington, like I said, the DC Penitentiary was the only federal prison in existence in the 19th century. And I think that tells us a lot about the role of the federal government in the 19th century, prior to the Civil War. It was very small. So quite literally, there were only 17 federal laws on the books. And most of them applied to the District of Columbia, or they applied to the coastal fortifications where members of the regular army were stationed. So the DC Penitentiary opened in 1831. It had a capacity of 214. And in 1862, Abraham Lincoln shut it down. It would later be opened in the post-war period to house some of the high-level Confederate officials. Its counterpart, military prison, was the old Capitol Prison. This building was commandeered by the federal government. Historically, its use was as the old Capitol. During the War of 1812, when the British came into Washington, D.C. and they burned it, the legislature was pretty much demolished, and the Congress actually moved into this building. And so originally, the building that you see here had a capacity of 500, but in 1862, the federal government commandeered a line of row houses that were behind it, and it expanded the capacity to 1,500. So Old Capitol Prison housed Confederate prisoners of war, suspected spies, and also Union deserters. Other northern location that I looked at was Ohio. The Ohio Penitentiary was eventually the largest penitentiary in existence in the antebellum period. Its capacity in the 1830s, after it was expanded, was 700, but its population rose to 900. So there's a parallel in how the state authorities in Ohio and military prison officials dealt with the increasing number of captives. They basically just expanded. They used what space they had. And so in the Ohio Penitentiary, when the population started creeping up towards mid-century, instead of housing men in solitary cells, they took spaces like the chapel and the dining hall and they put offenders in those spaces. In Ohio, I looked at 2 military prisons. One was Camp Chase. Camp Chase started off as a training ground for Union soldiers. It had a capacity of 4,000, and it ended up holding mostly political prisoners and Confederate prisoners of war. When men started to come into Camp Chase, particularly after the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson, Union officials decided that they wanted to separate the enlisted men from the officers. And so Commissary General of Prisoners William Hoffman looked to start a second military prison in the state of Ohio. And what better place to do that than in an island in the middle of Lake Erie? So that's where Johnson Island comes in. It's 300 acres. Johnson's Island, like I said, was primarily for Confederate officers. It was selected because it was close to Sandusky, Ohio. Prison officials felt that if they needed to get provisions to the prison, they could do that easily. And they also felt that if any Confederate officer decided that he wanted to escape, that Sandusky civilians would pretty much be on the lookout for them. So Confederate officers were held there, but like any other prison that we can talk about today, Johnson's Island also held civilian captives as well, and people who were guilty of violating military law. The last case study is North Carolina, so this kind of hits close to home. In North Carolina, they were one of the few states that before the Civil War decided not to establish a penitentiary. And so the North Carolina Penitentiary that you see there was debated throughout the antebellum period, but it didn't actually open until 1870. And when it did open, after the Civil War, there's kind of a parallel between the mode of captivity used at the North Carolina Penitentiary and Civil War military prisons, because they started putting criminals in there when it wasn't yet finished. So it didn't have a building, it just basically had a stockade, and guards were pretty much walking around on pigeon roosts like they would have done at places like Andersonville. So when the Civil War came around, and the Confederate government wanted to open a military prison in North Carolina, they had to get over their, for lack of a better word, allergy to imprisonment. And eventually, the people of North Carolina competed to actually house the site of the prison. State authorities offered the town of Salisbury, this is a tobacco warehouse there that you see on the screen, and the building, the main building that you see there, had dimensions of approximately 120 by 45 feet. The maximum capacity of that building and surrounding environs for Salisbury was 2,000. So the question becomes then, how does the antebellum period actually shape Civil War contemporaries' thoughts about imprisonment? And there's a couple ways that we can answer that. The first is by looking at the annual reports of the Boston Prison Discipline Society. These reports first came out in 1826. They were written by a group of middle-class white reformers who paid attention to the issue of imprisonment and really kind of set the standards by which prisons were judged throughout the century. First, what they did is they compared all institutions of confinement together in one report. So, for example, they considered prisons in Europe, insane asylums, local and county jails, houses of refuge for juvenile delinquents in the United States, and in the 23rd annual report, published in 1848, they even included a report on military imprisonment in Great Britain. So military prisons and penitentiaries are spoken of in one report. The Boston Prison Discipline Society in the antebellum period outlined the standards that prisons should meet. Regarding prisons' constructions, they said that members should be particularly concerned with security, inspection, ventilation, light, cleanliness, and sickness. And all of these concerns came back and were voiced again during the Civil War. The members of the society also said that prisons should be orderly. They outlined rules and regulations related to the institution's cleanliness, the classification of inmates, inmates' clothing, their diet, their employment, and both the government of and mode of punishments used in prisons. Other major concerns that the society emphasized were, again, religious instruction and inmate mortality. So, for example, in the 1830s, inmate mortality in the Midwestern prisons reached 5%. And the middle-class reformers went crazy about this. So we can understand why, with the figures I showed you first on that first slide, why Civil War contemporaries got so upset about the high percentage of men that died while in the hands of the enemy, if they're concerned about criminals originally in the antebellum period. The second example that we can look to understand how thoughts about imprisonment were formed prior to the Civil War is by turning to Francis Lieber. Francis Lieber was a German-American jurist and political philosopher. In the 1820s, before he immigrated to the United States, Lieber himself was held as a political prisoner by the Prussian authorities for his alleged role in a plot between the German and French secret societies to overthrow their respective governments. So once he got out of prison, he came to the United States, and in 2 documents in the antebellum period, he articulated his concerns about imprisonment. And they're really informed by his own experiences. So the first is his popular essay on penal law, which was published in 1838. And the second was a letter that he wrote to the South Carolina governor, whose last name was Noble. So in these documents, Lieber emphasized that certainty, not severity of punishment, was most important. He also said that punishment should be humane. Now, if we fast forward to the Civil War, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln called on Francis Lieber to draft the laws of war for the government of the armies in the field. These eventually became known as the Lieber Code, also known as multiple names here, I guess, right? Also known as General Orders Number 100. And a certain section of the Lieber Code dealt with imprisonment. And the issues that Lieber raised in the Lieber Code really echoed his antebellum writings. And so in General Orders Number 100, in relation to prisoners, he emphasizes the values of humanity, honor, and justice, which were also emphasized in his thoughts on how to treat penitentiary inmates. He also said that during wartime, the state employs military law, which, according to Lieber, should be strictly guided by the principles of justice, honor, and humanity. Those directly harken back to those 2 documents that he wrote in the antebellum period that I mentioned before. He also dictated that prisoners of war should be subject to imprisonment as necessary for safety, but that the modes of treating captives may be varied according to the demands of safety. So in some ways, the Lieber Code is a little bit contradictory. It seems to forbid things like retaliation, but then a few lines later it will actually condone it. The last thing that Lieber said really echoed one of the key tenets of the penitentiary program, and that was labor. So Lieber wrote in the code that prisoners of war may be made to work for their captor's government. So throughout the century, like I said, individuals, law-abiding individuals, believed that prisoners should pay for their own upkeep. So if we look back to the antebellum period, there's a couple examples of that. In 1836, the directors of the Ohio Penitentiary joyfully anticipated the day when, their words, the virtuous portion of our community will cease to be taxed for the support and punishment of the criminal. Similarly, the committee appointed to inspect the Virginia Penitentiary in 1824 contended that society must be entitled to remuneration from convict labor, emphasizing that convicts should support themselves since they broke the law. So these ideas carried over directly to the Civil War and to the government of military prisons. In July 1863, Richmond's provost marshal, whose name was Isaac Carrington, urged Captain W.S. Winder to employ Castle Thunder inmates who were serving long sentences to materially lessen the cost of their keeping. Later the same year, Carrington contended that federal deserters, most of whom were foreigners and common laborers, should work, and so they were put to work building fortifications and performing manual labor for the Confederate Army. At Salisbury in 1864, Assistant Adjutant General Garnet Andrews, after evaluating the prisoners held there, concluded that there were numerous Yankee deserters and convicts who were skillful mechanics, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, joiners, harness makers, and tailors. So he contended that under a good system of discipline and with a good supply of tools, that Salisbury Prison may be made not only self-sustaining, but could also turn a profit to the government. And that's exactly what the state governors wanted the penitentiaries to do in the antebellum period. At the old Capitol Prison in Washington, U.S. authorities used labor on the public works to relieve overcrowding and also their expense. In March 1863, General-in-Chief Henry Halleck noted that 100 prisoners were sentenced to hard labor on the public works and rejoiced that the number is daily increasing. Inmates' labor, according to Halleck, alleviated costs and eased official supervisory burden since the prison was already much too crowded. Same thing happens at Camp Chase. In July and December 1862, U.S. officials used inmates to dig vaults, whitewash buildings, drain standing water, and construct roads to improve the camp. Inspector H.M. Lazelle demanded that all labor at Camp Chase, designed in any manner to benefit the prisoners or for their own comfort, should be performed by the prisoners themselves as far as it was practicable to save money. Same situation translated over into Andersonville. Like I said before, the Confederacy is really pretty strained by the time it's actually constructing that prison. And in February and March of 1864, Colonel Alexander W. Persons, who was commanding the general post, authorized the formation of a detail of prisoners to work on the different buildings. So the federal government, like I said, wasn't too experienced in running prisons. That job was left mostly to the state. And in some cases, most pronounced in the case of Ohio, there were state governors, like this guy here, his name was David Todd, he was the governor of Ohio during the early years of the Civil War. They were really jealous of their ability to oversee imprisonment, whether it be penitentiaries or military prisons. So this caused some confusion. David Todd always thought himself in control of Camp Chase since its establishment. He issued orders for Camp Chase. He referred to himself in communications with the federal government as Governor and Commander-in-Chief. He appointed commandants for Camp Chase, and he also directed federal officials to either remove or investigate prisoners' cases. The federal government, once Camp Chase started running, decided that that's a federal military prison and they should assert authority over it. But oddly enough, federal officials who were sent on that mission had a hard time actually doing that. So the U.S. government, again, sends H.M. Lazelle out to Camp Chase in 1862. His job was to meet with David Todd, and the goal was to establish federal authority over Camp Chase. But in his personal writing, Lazelle says that he didn't deem himself at all justified in suggesting to Todd, in more than the most general terms, that Commissary General William Hoffman had power over all matters concerning the prisoners at Camp Chase. So this kind of left the door open for Todd to still think that he was in charge. And Todd's influence over Camp Chase continued until April 1863, when Brigadier General John S. Mason of the U.S. Volunteers, who was a professional military man, assumed command of Camp Chase and clearly increased federal oversight. The lines of authority were unclear between state and federal officials, but this also kind of permeated the prison and was evident to civilians. And civilians were a little bit concerned about what was actually going on with Camp Chase. So in 1862, when Todd still believed that he was in control, local pastor N.A. Reed denounced rebel soldiers as criminals, invoking that parallel, and believed that they should be, his words, treated with humanity as we treat convicts in a penitentiary. But he admitted that this was a difficult task, especially since it seemed to be a mixed question as to who actually had authority over Camp Chase. So that's an example from the North. An example from the South comes directly from Salisbury Prison. The Confederate authorities in Salisbury who were running the prison, the first commandant's name was Braxton Craven, and he was appointed by the governor of North Carolina. And once he's appointed, he's not really sure who he should report to. And so he petitioned Confederate authorities, specifically Secretary of War Judah Benjamin, to see if Benjamin would in fact recognize that Braxton Craven was in charge. So Craven asked for recognition. He asked if he should report to Benjamin regarding matters of the prison. And he also said that he needed an upgrade in rank since his rank was captain. And members of the guard force actually outranked him. The final request that Craven gave to Secretary Benjamin was for the Confederate government to actually spend money to employ a chaplain full-time to deal with the spiritual needs of the inmates that were held there. So in reply, Secretary Benjamin reluctantly concluded that if Governor Clark thought Craven the best man for the job, that he supposed that he could oversee the prison and muster a guard force. But he left his rank unchanged. He did, however, grant Craven the request of a chaplain. So that did come to fruition. State and local control over prisons in the antebellum period inspired some confusion, as we saw, between state and federal officials over military prisons during the Civil War. So there's an influence there as far as authority goes. There was also an influence from the Penitentiary Program on the kinds of punishments that were actually meted out in military prisons. So the Penitentiary Program itself, one of its main founders, was a Revolutionary War captain whose name was Elam Linz, and he devised his thoughts about punishment and imprisonment basically based on his experience in the United States Regular Army. The United States Regular Army and penitentiaries really kind of controlled the same types of people during the early part of the 19th century. There wasn't a lot of high regard for the Regular Army, and this is, again, separate from the volunteers, so don't think the guys that answered the call in 1861. This is the Regular Army, who were basically largely constabulary. They built forts, either on the coast or in the Western Territories. And a lot of times, the Regular Army officers actually went into penitentiaries to recruit them. And so it makes sense then that penitentiary discipline and discipline in the Regular Army were pretty much the same. So Linz's vision for the penitentiary program basically involved a daily routine for inmates where they rose and slept by a bell, they answered dutifully at roll call, they assembled in companies in the prison yard after they were going to work, and they marched everywhere in lockstep. So basically Linz wanted an army of captive workers, who were also prisoners, who would live in solitary confinement at night, work in congregate shops during the day to manufacture things like shoes, nails, clothing, saddles, things that could turn the penitentiary a profit. So the prisoners were under relatively close supervision. But so were the guards, really. And guards in the antebellum period at penitentiaries and at military prisons during the Civil War had hard work, low pay, and relatively little glory. So for example, the rules for the Ohio Penitentiary prohibited guards from having any type of conversation. They had to maintain a constant presence in the prison and prevent communication between convicts. Guards themselves were ordered to refrain from singing, whistling, immoderate laughter, boisterous conversation, and exciting discussions upon politics, religion, or other subjects which may disturb the harmony and good order of the prison. Same thing carries over into military prisons. As far as Castle Thunder's guards were concerned, they couldn't speak with each other, and the only time that they could interact with inmates was to see if inmates had to be moved to any location in the prison. Similar story happens at Andersonville. Andersonville's guards, when they're on duty, cannot talk with each other. If they were to communicate with inmates, it was basically to be supervising a work detail, and if guards were permitted to have a furlough to go home, when they came back to Andersonville, they were in no way permitted to congregate together or talk about really any of the subjects that we heard restricted in the rules for the Ohio Penitentiary. Prison officials were responsible for meting out punishments, and the punishments, again, that were executed in military prisons were really defined by the penitentiary program. So we can take, for example, Camp Chase prisoner John King. John King, in 1864, wanted to get out of Camp Chase, so he's pondering escape. But he's going to meet some potentially stiff resistance, one from the guards. And also, if he tries and he gets caught, he knows that he could be suspended by the thumbs, compelled to hard labor with a ball and chain attached to his ankle, or bucked and gagged for hours in a cold solitary cell. So we see those images here. This is an image of bucking. This individual doesn't actually have a gag in his mouth, but that's where it would have been. This is hanging by the thumbs. Another popular punishment would be if, this guy's a thief. So people who were in prison or in the military would have been made to wear a placard and march back and forth. Or the other option was you would carve the letter, the first letter of the offense of which you were guilty, in the head for everybody to see. So these sketches were done by Charles Wellington Reed. He was a member of the Union Army of the Potomac. But again, they represent military disciplines. These punishments were used in the Army, and they're also replicated in penitentiaries and military prisons. Military prison inmates and penitentiary inmates committed the same offenses. They insulted guards, devised escape plots, fought with or stole from each other, and demonstrated general disobedience. Officers at both institutions then could punish these recalcitrant inmates with bread and water diets. They could force them to wear irons or a ball and chain. They could keep them in a solitary cell in close confinement. They could implement bucking and gagging. They could confine inmates in the dungeon. They can shoot escapees, which was sanctioned under the laws of war and sanctioned in penitentiary discipline as well. The last punishment that they could mete out, which we saw on the last slide here, was whipping. It's interesting to note that whipping was a punishment that was used in the Army, the regular Army, throughout the 1830s. It was then banned. There were a number of wardens that petitioned to have whipping reinstated. By the time the Civil War broke out, the Union government had abolished whipping as punishment, but the Confederate government still accepted it. So one of the commandants of Castle Thunder, whose name was George Alexander, was investigated by the Confederate Congress, but one of the things they complained about was that he whipped inmates. But in the aftermath of that investigation, they basically said that Alexander was well within his right to whip the inmates because that was necessary to instill discipline. So that was a similar conversation about whipping that was had in the antebellum period. So moving away from punishments, both institutions, penitentiaries and military prisons, were supposed to inspire their captives to reform. In penitentiaries, that reform might take place in one of two ways. Through the program of labor, education, you'd come out on the other end once your sentence is done to be a productive member of society. The other way that you could reform is finding God. So that instance of finding God carried over into military prisons. But the other way that I argue that military prisoners were encouraged to reform was to be transformed into a loyal citizen of its captive's government. So there were different ways that these various dynamics of reform played out. Like I said, there were supposed to be chaplains in the penitentiaries, and sometimes there were. And sometimes, as in 1839 at the Ohio Penitentiary, the chaplains felt that they affected meaningful change. So Charles Fitch in 1839 noted that many Ohio penitentiary inmates were finding God. They were changing their ways. Similarly, in the D.C. Penitentiary, Warden Isaac Clark in 1835 noted that there were many inmates who, after attending divine service on Sunday, manifested a noted change in their religious disposition. Sometimes, even the chaplains themselves, though, had to undergo a little bit of reform. And a good example of that comes out of Salisbury Prison. There was a chaplain in 1862 named A.W. Mangum, and he had to travel frequently from Hillsborough to Salisbury. And in one instance, he complains to his mother in a letter that after he makes that journey, he was, quote-unquote, forced to preach 2 long sermons to the inmates of Salisbury, which seems like a kind of a strange complaint for a chaplain to make. So a few lines later, he corrected himself, and he said that his services were doing good work, that inmates were changing their ways, they were finding God, and that this was all worth it in anticipation of the heavenly reward that would actually come. In some cases, even the military prison's relatives, if they were on opposite sides of the conflict in the Civil War, thought that imprisonment was warranted, and they thought that it could inspire change of loyalty. So an example of this came in June 1863, when one newspaper in Washington printed a letter from a loyal Baltimore Unionist. and he was writing about his turncoat brother who was caught serving in the rebel army and then was incarcerated at the old Capitol Prison. So the Baltimore Unionist basically said that imprisonment at the old Capitol Prison would encourage his wayward brother to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. And by doing that, he would have atoned for the sins that he committed against the U.S. government and also the sins that he committed against God, who commanded him to obey the laws of his country. In the South, at Andersonville, inmate William Peabody noted that bad things happen in prison. There's a lot of guys, it's overcrowded, resources are scarce, and he said that swearing, wickedness, theft, all of that occurs inside of Andersonville. And the existence of those things inspired him to reform. And so in a letter to his wife, Peabody claimed that if he were to live and come out of Andersonville, he felt that the experience would make him a better person and that he would never again find fault with anything. The image here that we see is a guard register. This is from Johnson's Island. And when I was in the archives doing research, I thought this was really interesting because this is a document on which guards are supposed to write the infractions of inmates and the punishment. But instead, this guard took the time to write the Our Father. And so that indicated to me how important religion was, not just for penitentiary and military prison inmates, but also for the guards. And throughout the century, what we see is family members outside or members of the clergy actively encouraging inmates to cling to hope in God in order to survive. Like I said, there was supposed to be a chaplain in the penitentiaries before the war. The extent to which that happens depended on funding, but that assumption carried over to the Civil War. And so, for example, in Sandusky, Ohio, near Johnson's Island, was a local Catholic priest whose name was Father Mullen, and he noticed that the Confederate inmates being held at Johnson's Island had absolutely no resources for their spiritual guidance. And so he petitioned the federal government for permission to go into Johnson's Island